Hello, welcome everyone. I'm James Harding. I'm the editor and one of the co-founders of Tortoise, and welcome to our open news meeting. If you're a member of Tortoise, if you're one of my colleagues, you'll know I've been away for the last few weeks at the back end of August and had one of those rejuvenating times, partly when you stop reading the news and I find just read novels and see what you make of the news as it sometimes drifts past you, sometimes swamps you, but not with an attitude that you wake up every day feeling an obligation to be on top of things, to try and understand things. And I suppose I start this autumn with an extraordinary sense of quite how fascinating the times we are in, and quite how confused and conflicted I am by a world in so many ways that seems to be coming apart. And what I mean by that is, when you look at the economics, this sense that this is a time when we're going to see such stark winners and losers, such a different set of pictures, whether you're talking about increasing numbers of people facing unemployment, potentially long-term unemployment, at the same time as markets soaring and certain sectors, certain companies booming. A world coming apart when you think about the very different experiences by age and geography, income, race, gender of people dealing with the coronavirus, and how specific it is and how devastating it is for some people and how it doesn't seem to touch others. I saw my colleague Chris Cook touched on the relationship between infections and hospitalizations, and I suppose this autumn we'll be doing a lot trying to understand how the virus is developing and where it's spreading. And I think too about the way the world's coming apart when I look particularly at what's happening in the United States, at a polarization that is angrier and more violent and more troubling than at any time I can remember in a long time of taking an interest and caring deeply about the US. And then the world itself coming apart. You know, we host next week our G7 Billion Summit, a look at world leadership and an attempt in our own modest way to try and identify what's on that to-do list for world leadership ahead of the UN General Assembly, UNGA, in the middle weeks of September. And again, it's hard to think of a time when the world is more coming apart. The US versus China, the UK and the EU are trying to figure out a Brexit deal. So it feels as though there is a great deal of divergence. The beauty of Tortoise is we were set up with an ambition to bring people together, to create a forum for civilized disagreement. I expect that these next few months, there's going to be a lot of that disagreement. These things are not resolved by often finding an easy or cozy middle way, but we hope that will be a place where in the next few months we can discuss some of these issues and understand them better. As you'll know if you're a regular at our open news meetings, what we try to do here is flush out subjects and story ideas for our long-term commissions, for our Tortoise files. Increasingly, as you'll see, they're led by audio by Kerry Thomas and Basha Cummings, who are in charge of what we're doing in those Tortoise files, and specifically the audio too, but also to flag up stories or ideas that we should be looking at in greater detail on the Sensemaker team. So Claudia Williams and Giles Whittell are looking always at, okay, how do we make sense of what's happening? What are the stories that are going unreported or underreported? And a team of different writers and editors, as I mentioned, Chris authored today. So stories and ideas for that. And in longer term, where there's subjects we think, actually, you know what, this is a big issue, but we don't really understand it, and we'd love to have a discussion before we did anything else. Well, I hope that the team, Liz Mosley and Liv Lee, are on the Think-Ins team. And so ideas you've got for things we should cover in Think-Ins, we'd love to hear those as well. So this is essentially me casting that net pretty wide. My colleagues on the call today are Zav Greenwood, who is going to be trying to bring your chat together. Zav's been involved in a long-term reporting project, which is hopefully coming towards an end in the next week or so. So this is his sort of hour of respite from that and chance to think about other things. And as ever, behind the scenes, Sam Hockley is there. So if you've got a point, I might ask Sam Hockley to bring you in. Where possible, do put your video on. It's great to be able to look at you and talk to you face to face. Zav, I'm just going to start with you because we've got our news list that we pulled together. Zav, just tell me, you've given a quick run through of the things that are on our minds. Do you want to talk us through what those are?
Yeah, hi, James. So some of the things we've been thinking about are Kyle Rittenhouse, who's obviously been all over the news. He's been, the latest I read was that he's been charged with the murder of 2 protesters in Kenosha. Trump pretty much certainly failed to condemn his actions yesterday, was kind of talking about how he was defending himself and could have been killed. We've also been thinking about Exxon's departure from the Dow a couple of days ago. We've been thinking about Patriot Prayer, which is the far right movement in Portland, which is kind of gathering more attention given the riots and protests and the scuffles in Portland at the moment. And we've also been thinking about Blue Lives Matter or the idea of Blue Lives Matter, because the police still kind of remain under scrutiny. But as I've kind of said in the chat, we always want to hear from anyone about anything else we should be thinking about. So please do chip in on anything.
Thanks, Sav. And can I just say one thing? We talked a lot and thought a lot over the summer about a sort of authentically open newsroom, one where you really did talk about the things you don't understand as much as the things that you care passionately about. And I'll give you an example. You know, one of the things that I was struck by in this morning's Sense Maker was the note that the wife of Yasser Arafat, the former head of the PLO, or the had come out in favor of the Israeli-UAE deal. And the implications of that seem to be profound and surprising, but I have to confess I don't fully understand it. And it's that kind of thing where if people have gotten a point of view, they go, actually, you know what, here's a subject which I don't particularly understand, or one that I'm intrigued by, but would love to know more. Please do feel free to just sort of raise it in the chat. We'll just take a note of it. If you raise it, it doesn't mean that you are then required to become the professor of Gulf studies in that moment. It could just be, here's something interesting to follow up on. But I'm going to start, if I may. I'm hoping that my colleague Giles Whittell is here. Giles, you there? I want to just start by just raising, I think we're going to spend a fair bit of time talking about the Kyle Rittenhouse story and what we're making, what's happening in the US. But I just wanted to pick up on something that looks very boring, but might be quite significant, which is Exxon leaving the Dow, right? This is one of those classic stories. When I was at the BBC, Giles, I would often come in and have a moment where I'd say, you know what, I really love this Exxon leaving the Dow story. And you could see everyone around the newsroom table sort of put their head in their hands because, in their words, there were no pictures. And no story says no pictures like a listed company leaving a listing. But just tell me, why is it that you know, when we were sort of talking about issues for the week, you think this is something to look at?
Well, the first health warning is this has happened before. I didn't know this until reading a Bloomberg story on this morning. But for most of the '80s, the first decade of this century, Exxon itself was the only so-called super major in the Dow. Chevron wasn't. But now Chevron is, Exxon's out of it. And it's interesting to me, at any rate, because the question it poses is this the end? If Exxon doesn't come back and Chevron slips out, what does that tell us about the world we're moving towards? I think it's really, and we should note that the Dow chooses companies for this index on the basis of share price, not market cap, all right? So that can be affected by things like stock splits and minutiae of markets that I don't understand. But Chevron has a very high share price at the moment. Exxon's is small, so it slipped out and it's been replaced by Salesforce, the cloud computing company. Again, really interesting because it shows that, broadly speaking, and I speak not as a specialist, we're moving from a sort of, and this may sound over-optimistic, moving from a carbon-based to a digital-led economy. And of course, on top of Salesforce, you have the giants that are leading all the indices now, the giants of big tech, Amazon, twice as big as it was a year ago. But back on oil, this is despite the fact that the US is a huge oil exporter. Its shale industry has not collapsed as a result of falling oil prices. It turns out, as Dieter Helm told us in last year, that their costs in the shale sector are much more flexible than was thought. So they can keep going at pumping oil and exporting oil, even as world oil prices fall. So this has happened despite the fact that the US remains not just a big producer, but a big exporter. And there are short-term indicators that are bad for oil, including slump in demand from aviation and that kind of thing. But that'll come back in due course. Cars are going to keep on burning petrol and diesel for a long time. But something, well, I mean, the question is, has something longer term happened here? And a point, James, that you raised earlier is interesting. Are these massive super majors going to start going private? To what extent will they become a target for private equity? And also, what is the future of the big national oil companies? As I understand it, and this has been explained to me by people who know more at Thinkins before, one of the key structural problems for the big publicly listed oil and gas majors at the moment is the price of credit. They fund exploration with debt, by raising debt. And if lenders begin to worry that new oil and gas finds are actually going to end up staying underground as stranded assets, then they cease lending or they raise the price of lending. To what extent do those, go ahead.
No. I'm just, finish the point, Joel, sorry.
To what extent will those economic conditions apply to private equity? To what extent will those economic conditions apply to Aramco, Petronas, Pemex, Rosneft, the big boys of the nationalized oil and gas industry?
Okay, I'm going to, David Nash, I think David Nash put his hand up on purpose. I hope so, because I'm going to bring him in a moment. I just wanted to say for everyone here, I think there's something interesting for us in this, because on the face of it, thinking about covering markets and market indices couldn't feel less tortoise. There's nothing more fast moving than a set of stock prices. But actually, the thing that I've thought for a while is that very few people cover the markets in a way that thinks about what they're telling us structurally. And the reason why the Exxon Dow story is really interesting to me is, you're right, is it a story that is on the face of it about declining expectations and the value of hydrocarbons? Right? Or is it, as you say, actually about the fact we are going to still have oil majors, we are going to have huge oil companies because demand isn't going anywhere, but they're just going to move out of the publicly listed sector and into the private sector. They're going to be private companies. And what will that mean for accountability and for net zero? So there's a structural question there that's interesting. I think there's also a kind of be careful what you wish for question here, which is, okay, well, you may have a view on oil companies, but you should probably have a view on the sales forces of the world, because if we are seeing markets rise, but the value of those markets are concentrated in such a small number of particularly tech companies, that has an impact on the relationship between wealth and employment. And so what happens when your markets are very high, but the distribution of the wealth through those markets is very narrow. And then I suppose there's a kind of third and bigger question, which is, why is it we aren't talking more about the fact that the markets seem to be in an entirely different mood from the people. And the markets have come to the end of August thinking, woohoo, we've never seen anything like it. We couldn't be more upbeat about the future. And most people you're talking to are about job security, possibility of redundancy. Could we, should we go back to the office? And I think there's something to be derived from what the market optimism is telling us about, not just the next few months, but 2021. So I think there's something structural there. I'm going to go to David Nash because you've got your hand up, but I don't know, David, whether or not you've done that because you're just...
Okay, can you hear me, James?
I can hear you, but I can't see you.
Yeah, do you know, all your viewers are cleverer than I am at using, and my video isn't working, so
Fine. So we'll speak away, and we'll listen.
Yes, Giles will have heard this before. We need to be careful what we wish for. Yes, it's all very well, BP, Shell, and Exxon disappearing, but what you get instead, as the person providing, as the institution providing hydrocarbons, is going to be Putin, bin Salman, and Khomeini and Bolsonaro, who none of us really face. But James, could I raise a much bigger point, and I think it's a generic point, and that is that as much as I love Tortoise, and I think it's a terrific vehicle for honest and frank explanation, we're talking about 500 million people all the time. What we forget, the 7.5 billion people on the planet, 7 billion of them don't know anything about the fossil fuel crisis. All they're hoping for is that they can get some gasoline or something of that sort. And I think there was something on the BBC the other day which was seeming to imply that this was now the start of the end of the fossil fuel era. And all I'm saying is, yes, I hope so, but my God, let's make a transition and make sure that the thing is not chaotic, that it's ordered. That's what that would be the general point I'm trying to make. Thanks.
I mean, Giles, do you want to pick up on that? Because I think, I mean, I remember we had Dieter Helm in our office, David, a few months ago.
Yeah.
And the thing that was the most striking that he said was that actually, if you look all the way since Kyoto, there's a straight line in terms of consumption and demand of fossil fuels. And even the last year has seen, I guess, more talk about net zero and responsibilities to the planet, the reality is, even in that year, we've seen greater demand and higher emissions, pre-COVID this is. So, Giles, what do you make of David's point just about the fact that, if you like, we're talking in a kind of bubble of 500 million people?
Yeah, it's a big bubble, but it's a great point, well taken. And let us please grapple with it on our net zero thinking on Thursday evening. The last thing I want to do is just to be a bunch of woolly liberals encouraging each other in our delusions. This also relates, of course, to global leadership. I feel that more and more strongly, and in a sense, the importance of the looming American election. Though, of course, a lot of forlorn hopes will be invested in that, whoever wins. But I mean, I don't know if David feels the same way, but I feel more and more strongly that whatever well-intentioned moves those 500 million people make on a small scale, to do with their diet, to do with their lifestyle, to do with their travel, there have got to be some massive structural calls taken by world leaders, probably without a conventional democratic mandate, to put a proper price on carbon, to do sort of moonshots or Manhattan projects or Marshall Plans, whatever you want to call them, to enable the other 7 billion to leapfrog carbon technologies to something which is lower carbon and therefore, assuming we have the science right on global warming, better for the planet, but which also, makes lives better for a host of other reasons. But absolutely, to be sure, ain't going to happen without some really enlightened leadership and the past 30 years give absolutely no reason to hope it's coming.
So I'm going to give a plug because Giles is too modest to say so, but if you looked at last week's file at the reporting where a bunch of members helped us think through how you would get to net zero by 2030 rather than 2050, actually, I think that'll flesh out for you a number of the ideas, I hope, David, that do talk about making these changes. I wouldn't necessarily say in an orderly way, but certainly in a dramatic and urgent way. I'm just going to, if I might, ask Sam Houston, are you there? The only reason I say that is that you mentioned a few things in the chat about efforts. Hello, Sam, how are you? About just trying to move big cities away from cars. And I remember I once asked the head of Fiat whether he thought we'd reached peak car. And at the time, and this is a fair old while ago, this was 8 years ago, I guess, he said he thought we'd reached peak urban car, right? i.e. that the car companies themselves were already expecting, sort of anticipating that. But you're saying that the governments now, mayors' offices, etc., are trying to move us away from cars. What evidence have you got for that?
The DfT funded, I think, £250 million to councils to kind of accelerate the move towards active travel, particularly in the large urban areas. So you've got low traffic neighbourhoods springing up all over London, and I think elsewhere as well. I think possibly Birmingham. And the other big move has been the thing called street space, which is kind of an overlap. I mean, a lot of it's got quite jargony sounding names, but essentially it is trying to encourage, i.e. Discourage people from driving, basically, and try to get more people, wholly admirable, more people to walk and cycle.
Right. And wasn't it, Sam, there was a story, I can't remember where, I might have been on a thinking, or it might just be my holiday brains means I heard it in a conversation of Los Angeles. There was a story going around about councils putting up 30-mile speed limits, so lots and lots of signs around cities with a view that you could strip them off easily one day and just turn them into 20 miles. There was a big plan to bring down the speed limits around all cities. Is that just an urban myth, or is that true?
No, I mean that has happened in London already, and even on the TfL controlled roads now, some of them again for reason, good reasons, because clearly the slower traffic moves, the fewer accidents there'll be. But the wider policy to that you're talking about car ownership, definitely. I don't know if you've heard this idea. It's quite recent. I can't remember in which paper, talking about the 15-minute cities. This kind of idea that people won't travel across large urban areas anymore. They'll spend more time in their own area. This is a kind of futurist thing, but the move away from private car use in London certainly is well advanced. And the problem being at the moment, clearly, that there was some discouragement, and that would remain for people to use tubes and buses. So the idea was that they would try to get as many people walking and cycling as they possibly can. So you've got a cycle lane down the Euston Road, and you've got another one on Park Lane, and the low traffic neighbourhoods with the planters and things like that. It will be interesting to see kind of how that pans out. But this thing about the fossil fuels, that definitely, I think that private car ownership is, both in cities but also elsewhere, is kind of on the way out, and people are trying to kind of envisage transport, car travel as a service in the future.
Well, by the way, I know you might have seen, Sam, in the Sense Maker today, Chris Cook flags up this brilliant piece by Sarah O'Connor. I don't know whether you ever read. She's I think she's public policy editor at the FT, and she's exceptionally good, I think. And she's written this brilliant piece on the Pret economy.
I did read that. Yeah, I read the piece. Yeah.
It was good, wasn't it?
Yeah, I read the piece. Yeah, and that's true. Look, I've been in and around London, throughout pretty much, and it's true, things are being, really slow to recover. This debate, who's going to come back to offices and who's not going to come back to offices. I think ultimately they'll be able to sell the office space in London, but I think the idea that there might not need to be quite as many kind of service industries or that those service industries may have to change somewhat. I think that's a reasonable assumption. Certainly, nothing is coming back very quickly at the moment.
Well, it certainly seems like in town, doesn't it? Sam, listen, thank you. I want to get onto this subject of Carl Rittenhouse and the polarization of, if you like, the justice versus law and order debate within the US presidential election. But I'm going to do one thing before I do that, which is, if I might, I'm going to ask if he's there, Tortoise. Firstly, I may have pronounced your name wrong. Secondly, I'm in the very, very happy position of knowing that I don't know anything about Montenegrin politics. So will you just tell us what happened, given that we've all had our attention on places like Belarus and so may have missed this entirely?
Good afternoon.
Hello.
Sorry. Well, I myself wasn't really too knowledgeable about about Montenegrin politics, but recently, a few weeks back, I looked and found out about the protests that were going on of 300,000 people in a population of 600,000, all against the current president of Montenegro, Đukanović, mostly over the new law that he introduced, which almost had a Henry VIII kind of style to it, of seizing the property of the Orthodox Church, the Serbian Orthodox Church. And over the past 10 years or so, well, since independence, Đukanović was pushing a separate identity to the ethnic Serbs and trying to push a Montenegrin Orthodox Church, despite it not really being that popular, to really further his own political agenda. But that point was a kind of straw that broke the camel's back and angered many people who themselves see them their own identity closely linked to Serbia. So even center-left to populist nationalist Serbs have united in not only religion but also in politics, and a new big tent or catch-all party formed, known as the Future for Montenegro, and they have, I think, together now had gained 4 seats in the 81-seat parliament of Montenegro, meaning that Đukanović now cannot really be placed as prime minister anymore, because he was president, but he was using the Putin trick of switching the roles every term.
Okay. All right. Well, this. I feel bad because you've actually teed up one of those things, A, that, as I said, I know nothing about, and B, that's sort of absolutely fascinating. And now I'm going to do to you, Tortoise, I'm afraid, what sort of newsrooms all over the world are doing to stories like that, which is then switch the spotlight onto the United States. And it always feels this way, you know, in the run up to the beginning of November in an election year in the United States, that it just sucks all the oxygen out of world news and you find yourself focused on the US. But in this time, I hope you'll agree, there's a good reason for that, because this argument that we're seeing seems to me to be obviously one that is potentially going to determine the outcome of the US election, but also spill far beyond the US. I've got a number of colleagues who in different ways have either worked or written about politics in the United States. I'm gonna come, if I can, to my colleagues Merope and Dave, who've both been based out in the States most recently. But I'm going to start with Matt d'Ancona, if I might. Matt, I've begun to worry that as the election, and we're not partisan in Tortoise, but it's no surprise to understand why I perhaps would worry about this. There's the election, the center ground of the election moves, if you like, from competence over the coronavirus to an argument between, you know, justice and the Black Lives Matter movement on the one hand, and the quote unquote defenders of law and order on the other, that this is a swing that plays to Donald Trump, and the chances of him winning this election suddenly look much better than they did 6 weeks ago. Do you want to talk a little bit about how you see, particularly the Carl Rittenhouse case, but more broadly, how Donald Trump's playing it? Well, you're on mute, Matt. Are you there? Let's just check. Sam, can we hear from Matt? Or is it just me? No, you should be there. Try again. Oh, sorry. Matt, I'm going to come back to you in 2 shakes. Let's see. Let's see. Sam, you see if you can figure out Matt, and I'm going to see if Merope, can I come to you? You are muted. Now, there
Hello.
you go.
Hi,
Hello.
James.
Hello.
Hello, everybody.
Hello.
Um,
How was Wales, by the way?
It was delightful. Thank you very much.
Good.
Rainy but delightful. But I won't bother everyone with that right now. No. So on the American election, so like with Dave, we were both there in America exactly this time last year, and it's all coming back to me like PTSD, and how wrong everyone got it, including, you know, I lived in California, and it now seems like that sort of bubble of the West Coast, where it certainly seemed from where we were sitting like it was going to be Hillary Clinton, and then it wasn't. And you know, I will confess that a lot of the journalism that both I read and that we produced was didn't see it coming. But the one thing that I did at the time that I wanted to bring up in this conversation, which seems pertinent to this to now, is that one thing that we did beforehand was that we got a load of Republicans to only look at a Facebook news feed that we'd created, which was liberal media. And it's not just sort of the New York Times, and a load of liberals to look at only right-wing Republican Fox News, Breitbart News in the lead up to the election. And we ran the results of that after the election. And it was so interesting, and it showed so much how much people were living in bubbles, and people talking about how they would watch the debate and see one thing, and then they'd go on and they'd see, you know, all this stuff about how Trump was talking about nasty women, and it hadn't even occurred to them that that would be the news agenda. And there still seems to me to be something now where we don't know how this election is going to go, because we don't know how people are behaving on Facebook. The New York Times had a really good piece about that again, and that is something I would really like to look at in the run up to this election, is how people behave and what they're reading on Facebook, and whether we can work with people to come out of their bubbles in the run up to the election.
And Merope, what happened, by the way, if you were a liberal, were looking at Fox or Breitbart,
yeah,
did you come away thinking, hang on, these people have got a point? Or did you strengthen your fury at the...
It wasn't just, I mean, you know, it did strengthen your fury, but they were coming across news that they would definitely not have come across otherwise. There was I remember there was quite a clear story of someone talking about how Hillary Clinton's battle bus had dumped loads of sewage in a particular constituency, and that was quite a big story within the Republican, or I shouldn't even say Republican, you know, it was more extreme than that, you know, that the extreme right conversation was so different, and it showed it was really a piece about filter bubbles. But even from that election, I think that things have gone even further away from Breitbart and Fox into more even more sort of smaller bubbles and smaller places, and that's one of the things I think that we should be looking at in the run.
And do you think, I mean, I'm picking up while you're talking, Zav flagged this thing which I hadn't seen, which is that Ben Shapiro, the conservative commentator, got 56 million total interactions. So that's, so if I'm right in thinking that's people who've read but also liked or sent on, which is more than sort of all the big news networks and the Times and the Post. So I'm struggling to work out exactly the things that we do in Tortoise. Part of it is obviously keeping tabs on this stuff through SenseMaker every day. But in terms of longer commissions, we could do something like that, which is around the filter bubble information point.
I mean, if we looked at what Zav has just put in there, which is what I mean, is what we did last time, it wouldn't work this time, because that time it was about Breitbart and places like that. And actually, I feel like news consumption has moved on into much more individual, Ben Shapiro, massive newsletters, you know, people who have subsequently, oh, who's that crazy guy who was always on YouTube, who's been, you know, kicked off of YouTube now? Inevitably, he will have his own massive audience that we will find
Oh, yes.
hard. What's his name? You know who I mean? He talked about
Milosh. What was his name? Were you talking about that guy?
he's the one who denied Sandy Hook. Alex Jones. Alex Jones. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Alex Jones, who's been kicked off a lot of the mainstream social media platforms, but he won't be quiet. He'll be somewhere. He'll have a sort of, you know, a huge audience somewhere. And I feel like that sort of Ben Shapiro statistic is evidence of how it's even beyond the Breitbart into more individual audiences.
There's a thing here, by the way. I'm just responding to you, Mary, just to point to Zav. There's Zav, people who weren't around at the time, did an absolutely amazing piece of reporting for us, must be about a year ago now, which is on Merthyr Tydfil and private social networks, but still hosted on platforms like Facebook. At the time, Zav, if I'm right, I remember we also looked at the beginnings of platforms for people who weren't necessarily, who might have even been kicked off Facebook or Twitter, but who could set up streaming services, if you like, direct to their own communities. And it might be worth, whether it's through WhatsApp or something else, someone's unmuted, by the way, is to go back and have a look at that. I don't know what you, is that
it was me who was unmuted. Sorry.
Yeah, okay, fine, sorry.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, lots of kind of commentators who get kicked off other social platforms use Discord, which, you know, started out as a gaming channel, is now a kind of channel where people kind of stream what they're saying. Parler has kind of emerged as a place where lots of people who've been kicked off have gone to. I mean, it is worth saying that I don't want to downplay the importance of these kind of new networks which people go to, because they're still really important. But I do think the evidence shows that when you do things like, for instance, kick Katie Hopkins off Twitter, it does massively reduce their reach. And I think similarly, Facebook kind of taking off lots of the QAnon accounts will reduce their reach, but we're right to be worried about it, and we're right that it is individuals who kind of have this power now.
It's worth, I guess it's one of these things maybe we should think about in that sort of series that we've done on the infodemic, thinking about a US election infodemic week, where we just think about those issues. And I see this Phoebe Davis just flagged up something which I hadn't seen about sort of specific setting up of groups and organizations. Matt, I just want to check, can we hear you?
Can you hear me now?
Yes, hello.
Great, great to see you. Yes, I mean, I think absolutely everything about the location and the need not to forget the continued influence of the alt-right outliers is very important. But I think also the way in which the tribe they represent is quite nimble in its behavioral patterns. And I think it's really important to go back. If you go back to Trump's inaugural address, the phrase that stood out was American carnage. And it was a very odd one. And actually, I think Bannon and Stephen Miller, his speechwriters, hadn't attached as much importance to it as Trump did himself. But his analysis was, in the end, my presidency is going to trigger a kind of dialectic between two kinds of America, one of which is liberal, coastal, elitist, educated, and then everyone else. In other words, the people Hillary Clinton called the deplorables, and then a bunch of other people on top of that. And the question always is the bunch of other people on top of that a sufficiency, both in the popular vote and then more crucially, the electoral college in the election on November the 3rd for Trump to win a second term. And what's so interesting about what's happened this summer is that it looked like there was a clear framing of the election, which was Trump's economic boom narrative was in trouble. He was handling the pandemic disastrously. And then along came the BLM protests to sort of add a cultural dimension to that as well. And that's been inverted, not least because of the way in which the events in Kenosha and Portland have been presented, but also because it's helped him to weaponize this whole idea of him, Donald Trump, as the person standing between this group on the one hand and that group on the other. And it's really striking his refusal to condemn the far right in this instance is so reminiscent of Charlottesville. It's so reminiscent of that moment when he said there were very fine people on both sides, and the world, drew in breath and said, "My God." But actually, for the Trump tribe, for the core Trump base, that was exactly what they wanted to hear. So this is none of which is to say he's going to win, but it does actually reflect in its own brutal kind of id way a strategy of sort.
I was saying to I was really struck over the weekend, Matt, by this piece that Andrew Sullivan, who you'll know and is this kind of frankly is very famous for being Andrew Sullivan these days, but the piece that he wrote about and it was in a number of different versions of it were in a number of places. I picked it up in the UK in the Times, but I don't know whether you saw it, which was a piece which essentially, if people hadn't read it, was a piece that essentially started out saying, look, I'm very conflicted by a lot of these things that Andrew Sullivan says, profoundly, passionately agrees with the good people at Black Lives Matter on redressing and addressing the sins of America's past, but also is enormously frustrated by those people who won't allow for or accept that there's been any progress, and that, describe the United States as a country that has made no progress on this front. And then he goes on to say, but on one issue he's not conflicted at all, and that's the requirement of law and order. And that if a government or a politician won't defend law and order, then he's a one-issue voter. There has to be law and order, because without that, there can't be a debate. And if liberals give up on law and order, fascists will make the most of that. And it's quite a striking argument, particularly for people who think to themselves, well, how do you find some middle ground? And I wonder what you think about that, and whether you think that for as much as it might look to us outside, that this quote unquote American carnage we're seeing on the streets in the United States must play to a challenger to Donald Trump. Actually, Joe Biden's response to what's happened in Portland and Kenosha actually suggests that there's something now of a momentum behind Trump.
Well, what's certainly true is that there was no momentum before, and there is now. Yeah. In the sense that, exactly for the reasons you describe, you can't be any head of government, let alone a president, unless you're offering minimum standards of order across the board. I mean, it takes many forms. I mean, one of the reasons the financial sector in the UK is so strong is because the rule of law is so strong. And so, the rule of law, basic order, is absolutely key to any form of any presidency. Now, the rebuttal to that, of course, is that you can say Trump has been incredibly disdainful for the rule of law, but let's just look at it in a kind of visual way. How are voters feeling this? They're looking at their screens, particularly if they watch specific channels such as Fox, and they're seeing flames, and they identify to a considerable extent those flames with the people that Trump is against. Now, again, that doesn't translate into a winning electoral coalition. It's not bad, and it's certainly much better than he deserves, given his performance in the pandemic. So, exactly as you say, the Dems have got a real problem. I think they should be deploying Kamala Harris more in this, actually, because she is, the critique of Kamala Harris from the Democrat left was that she was Kamala the cop. She was a former prosecutor, attorney general in California. She was someone who was anti-crime. And I think, actually, I'd send her there with a mission to actually make this completely and unambiguously clear.
Can I'm going to just invite Phoebe Davis. Phoebe, I don't know whether you've got your camera on and whether you're happy to speak, because I'm interested. We were talking this morning at our morning call just about Patriot Prayer and Blue Lives Matter and the organisation on what you'd think of as the right. And Phoebe, what do you make of this?
I think so. There's some interesting stuff on Parler and Telegram, and those kind of platforms. So I don't know if anyone remembers Gun Girl, very kind of activist, conservative activist. She's moved most of her content. She still uses Facebook. She still uses Twitter. But her Parler page, if you ever want to dive into it, is full of, you know, big Facebook, big Twitter, big tech. They shadow ban people. I can speak freely on this platform. And she gives you more content, and things like that. That kind of ways of activating those conversations is a lot easier through those platforms. So I think clearly Facebook is still important. It's still the big player, but they were organising riots, etc. Proud Boys also use Parler, use Telegram, and they're being pretty active in Florida. They're being pretty active in Washington, I think Michigan as well. So I think I kind of got into it a little bit and was looking at all the kind of the interrelations of these. So I think you need to look outside of big tech, definitely.
It's interesting. I'm gonna come in a moment, if I might, to my colleague Dave. But I also just wanted to say, Phoebe, firstly, welcome to Tortoise. I think you were a student ambassador of ours.
I'm actually at the new offices.
I know. So listen, will you do us a favour? On the spirit of an open newsroom, you are, I think, the first person in our new office. So will you, as well as sort of trying to navigate us through the darker corners of the internet, just show your screen around and say, as you can see here, this is where we're moving into. Somewhere, is Emma Harley in helping set things up? Okay, so
yeah, she's here as well.
I hope we're going to get a sighting of Emma Harley, who is the hero who's managed to decampus from one office to about 250 meters around the corner to the next one. And as you can see, he's done an amazing job. Anyway, Phoebe, welcome. It's great to see you. Dave, I tell you what I'm trying to get to is working out a way that we can do this in an interesting way, particularly around things that are not just, if you like, kind of fault lines that are philosophical, but organizational. So to give a sense of that, Giles and I talked this morning about, should we do a sense maker special at some point, and maybe Claudia's on the line can talk about this, a sense maker special about the postal service and mail-in voting and how it works in the United States. I know that's kind of can feel quite dusty in such a passionate election, but it's obviously going to be quite important. But I just wondered how much you think these organizations like, I don't know, Patriot Prayer or Blue Lives Matter really do matter in this thing, or this is actually sort of quite spontaneous and quite difficult to pin on organizations.
I think there's sort of two hold your nose and vote for Biden groups who need to show up, I suppose, for him to win, and they are, the uninspired progressive left who thought last time round, oh well, Trump's not going to win, so we're safe to go and vote for a third party or to sit on our hands. And then you've also got the sort of what you might think of as the decent Republicans, the sort of people who feel that their party's been subject to a hostile takeover and that are willing to hold their nose and say, we will vote against our party because it's in the national interest. So I feel like they're the two sort of constituencies in play, and I think some of the noise at the fringes is extreme and it is eye-catching, but it's I don't know, I think it can get overblown. It feels very dynamic, but it's not
dynamic in the sense that things are on the move.
Dynamic in the sense that it's hard to take your eyes off it when it sort of bubbles up, and it is a great deal more interesting for a news network than let's say a deep dive into the postal service and the machinations of that. But yeah, I think it although it looks very kinetic and energetic, I feel maybe we get seduced into covering it too much and overinflating its importance.
And can I ask you, Dave, because one of the things, when you were in the States, the Times and the Guardian, one of the things that you did, which was brilliant, and I'm always sort of slightly envious of, was you did much more than I ever did of actually getting out and going to different parts of the country, and rather than kind of sitting in DC and sort of stroking your chin, which I did a lot of. if the one thing I've never really understood and still don't understand is, if I'm a voter in Florida or Pennsylvania, how animated am I by what's happening in Oregon or Wisconsin? How much do those things really move the dial? How much will this be, do you think, a coronavirus election, and how much do you think it will be a George Floyd election?
Well, it's going to be a George Floyd election for a lot of people. I think that's incredibly galvanizing for African Americans, and I think that surely does, if this is all about turnout, this election, that surely does help Biden, because perhaps the Obama coalition that didn't sort of turn out for Hillary in such big numbers, will come for him because of that. But you can't help feeling that if elections are generally about really personal things that impact you and your family, then the stuff of health and of jobs are going to surely be writ large. It seems pretty obvious that while we sit thousands of miles away, like wringing our hands about waning American leadership on the global stage, that doesn't really play with voters in the US. But I do think that people aren't going to forget what's happened to their families when it comes to health and jobs. And I think with the pressure on Trump to kind of push past COVID and try and claim it all over, people can see with their own eyes that it isn't, and it's still writ large. So I don't, we're going to have a look at Florida in some detail in the next couple of weeks, and I think there's so much in play there. A year ago you would have said, guns is going to be the big issue in that state, because the Parkland school shooting seemed to have galvanized a generation, changed the conversation. Things seem possible. But again, things move so fast in this Trump era, don't they? That it's like no one talks about that anymore. And I although Matt's sort of fixing on the American carnage phrase from the inauguration speech, I can't stop thinking about the acceptance speech in Cleveland in 2016, when Trump vowed that safety would be restored to America on the 20th of January. And you look at his record presiding over the biggest mass shootings in modern American history. You look at how he's responded to COVID. Whether or not he claims any responsibility for violence on the streets, most rational people would say he's fueled that sort of division. It seems astonishing that it isn't that he can brazenly say, America will be safer under me than it will be under Biden, when he's presided over all of this.
Well, listen, I want to end. Someone, I think Louise made the sort of plank in our eye point, and so I want to end, Dave, if I might, just with one thing close to home. I have to confess, I came back in to work today, and amongst the few things that I sort of managed to be exercised about is Rule Britannia and Land of Hope and Glory. And I mentioned to someone this, I said I sort of had strong feelings about this, and I said, do you care? And they looked long and blank at me, and then just said, honestly, I just don't care. I just don't care what they play at the proms, or do sing or don't sing. I just don't care. So I want to just end, if I might, by doing 2 votes. I hope people know how Zoom, God love it, with its extraordinary profit margins and soaring revenue streams, how Zoom works by now. But Zoom, if you hit the participants tab, you'll see there's a thing that then means that you can raise your hand, right? And I just want to ask two questions. I'll tell you what they are so you don't feel as I'm going to trap you in some clever questioning. One is, do you care whether or not people do or don't sing Rule Britannia and Land of Hope and Glory at the proms, or do you not care? And so question one is that. And the second question is, do you think that it's time to make a change to what is sung at the last night of the proms? I.e., either, so I'm giving you two options. One is stay the same, and the other one is make a change, without stipulating whether that make a change is remove the words or remove the music altogether. So question one, do you care, right? So can you put your hand up if you care? It's difficult to know with this whether or not, so at the moment, the majority of people are like my unnamed colleague who frankly doesn't care. I mean, overwhelmingly doesn't care. Who cares, right? Okay, now, question two. Even if you care or you don't care, can you take your hands down? Whether you care or you don't care, do you think it's time to make a change? Wow, that's so interesting. Okay, great. Well, here we are. We're in the last minute of the first news meeting of the autumn, and I've learned two things. I am wildly out of step with pretty much everyone that I work with and fellow members of Tortoise, because I have to say I care deeply about it. And I also think that there's a need to change these things. If we're not engaged now in re-examining our history and moving on from saying and singing things by rote, when will we be? But maybe I'll save that for an editor's voicemail that probably will be listened to just by me. On that note, thank you very much, everyone, for joining us. Let me just give you a quick rundown on the week, which is quite meaty. We are going to tomorrow night have John Micklethwaite and Adrian Wooldridge. John is the editor of Bloomberg, previously the editor of The Economist. Adrian Wooldridge still works at The Economist. They've written a book called The Wake Up Call, which is about what the pandemic has shown us about the failings of particularly Western governments. So we'll have a thinking about that. And if you like, it is a different version of the project that Dave kicked off for us a few months ago, which was the How We Live Next project. It was about how we fundamentally need to make changes as a result of the pandemic. On Thursday night, Giles is going to follow up on the file we did last week on net zero by 2030 and have a thinking on what are the active changes that need to be made to get to net zero. And then on Friday, Claudia Williams and Giles Whittell will be hosting the Sensemaker Live, and our focus then is going to be what in Whitehall is called a hard rain, i.e. the argument between Downing Street and the civil service. If you remember, Dom Cummings said before the summer that a hard rain is going to fall on the civil service. Well, Simon Case is newly appointed as the head of civil service, and so on Friday we're going to take a deep look at Cummings, COVID, and the civil service, the battle for government. So please join us on Friday lunchtime for that. But if you have any thoughts, as ever, please do email me. Please let us all know. Thank you for joining today. We'll take away some serious thinking about markets, about the US elections, and of course about Montenegro too. Thank you everyone for joining us, and see you I hope tomorrow evening with John Micklethwaite and Adrian Wooldridge. Have a good day.